The Critical Conversations Project convened a multidisciplinary group of experts who explored spiritual approaches to ethical, environmental, and transcendent issues and the built environment. This session was dedicated to justice and participation and concluded with panelists sharing their ideas, solutions, and hopes for the future. We began with the question: how may built environments support equity and inclusion and encourage participatory and democratic decision-making processes?
Today we're facing entwined crises of class, systemic racism, biodiversity loss, and climate breakdown. And so, the emphasis coming out of architecture on these issues has largely been focused on design solutions. And I would argue that actually architectural artifacts have very little to contribute to being able to solve these crises or to address them meaningfully. And this is because architecture reflects the society that creates it, and we are living within global capitalism, and so architecture has largely been sort of relegated to being a commodity, primarily for the elite, for people who can pay for it. And so within this context, architectural practice is not a benevolent calling. And to actually call it that without thinking that we need some sort of dramatic change is actually very destructive. Because architecture has perpetuated and is perpetuating still a lot of harm.
The harms that architecture has been entangled with are not harms that are unique to architecture. Destruction of the environment, centering of whiteness, centering of male authority, centering of privileged classes, these are harms that are perpetuated by many professions. And many professions have been trying to rethink their relationship to these harms, to atone for them, and to, in fact, rethink the profession itself in light of greater participation and the centering of justice.
And so there are several turning points that the profession is facing. I think of them as 4 turning points. There's an ethical turn that is happening, where increasingly we're asking ethical questions about what are our responsibilities to the planet, to other people, to other species. There's an economic turn, which is that we're moving into a sharing economy, which has helped us understand the use of space very differently and more efficiently and effectively. There's what I think of as the epistemological turn, which is a greater demand for design thinking and our design methods to address issues beyond the design of buildings. And then there's the final one, which I think of as the experiential turn, which is that as a result of the pandemic, it's rebalanced the relationship of the digital and the physical world. And for the first time in human history, the physical world has a competitor, and people have a choice as to whether they do something remotely or in person. And so that forces us to think about the physical environment in terms of the experiences it can create that are different from what can be achieved online.
Ethics is a way of talking about the practices that really express the spiritualities, the practices that really express and then reinforce the claiming powers that we are wanting to choose for our professional practice. So for an ethical approach, we might think of the capacity of ourselves to achieve virtues through our professional practice. After all, part of what defines a profession is its capacity to be a public good. So what virtues help achieve and make good on that promise of the public goodness of the profession? So to what do we aspire in our professions? How do we talk about not only what not to do and what to avoid, but what to fulfill?
And so we should be redesigning our profession, our practices, our educational system. It's interesting, we as a field take a lot of risks when it comes to designing buildings, but we are the most conservative profession of all when it comes to reimagining our practices. And it's the same with higher education. We still have educational models that go back a couple centuries. And so, to me, what is needed is an ongoing design process that reimagines these systems that are inequitable and unsustainable, and that involves the participation of everybody affected by it. In education, we have to be listening to our students. Where do they want to learn? How do they want to learn? What do they want to learn? And we need to work with them in that. And the same is true in communities. What kind of built space do they need? What don't they need? What don't they want? What are the harms that we're not aware of that they are aware of? And so to achieve a more just future, it needs the participation of everybody affected by our decisions. So I see an enormous opportunity for design in the future, because we're at a moment where almost everything needs to get redesigned. The systems that we have are not working anymore for anybody. And so that is our role, that's our opportunity, and that's our charge, I think.
What we really need to do in order for any form of architecture to have meaning is to change the way that it's produced. So I think that there are three main areas that we need to focus on, which you'll see are kind of encapsulate a lot. So it's how we practice, who is able to practice, and who our practice then serves. So we're really talking about a wholesale transformation of the way that we're operating.
This is about professional practice, such as public health or public interest law. Now, what does a profession mean? According to Dr. Howard Gardner at the Harvard School of Education, a profession means to profess a mission. So that returns to this idea of aspirations, because we need to be aspirational. We need to think big to address these big challenges. So the mission I use for public interest design is every person should be able to live in a socially, economically, and environmentally healthy community. That is ambitious, right? But that is the change we need to happen.
It seems like we're at a moment in history where people are looking for alternative ways of understanding our place in the world and the way forward. And certainly for me, working among Navajo students, I'm learning new concepts about the environment, new worldviews, and for me, I think it's often rooted in a very strong sense of community, of clan, of family, and I've often referred to my colleague Ted Hohola's pronouncements about the importance of the 7-generation model, where one can understand oneself in relation to the generations that come both before oneself as well as after, and that it positions the planner or the architect in a place of, I think, humility, where there's a set of limits and constraints, and where one is bound to the responsibility of something larger than oneself.
I think architects have always dreamed of having social impact. But traditionally that's been a top-down process. And top-down process of the architect coming up with a vision and implementing it, it's almost impossible for that to be meaningful or valuable. So you have to have the community involved in that type of visioning process. So it's no longer top-down, it's participatory, so that we can have ideas, visions verified, redirected by the communities they're for. So that's one reason things are different. So we're actually making a difference after being collaborative with the communities. The second reason is we're collecting evidence to show that we can do this. And so for the last 20 years, there have been really creative people out there in trenches, on the streets, coming up with ideas, coming up with methods, coming up with professional models or hybrids with schools and nonprofits and for-profits, and really just testing things out and really wanting to see results, not theories, not proposals, not visions, but actual projects. So we have 20 years now of evidence of those projects happening. So that's convincing. So documenting the best practices and sharing those is something that's different now.
When we begin to understand the world from the perspective of others, it helps us ask, well, what is it that we're about? What is architecture? What are the fundamentals that we need to provide? So ethics leads us to different aesthetic outcomes.
I think that in many ways it's an alternative to what one might call the wow factor in architecture, or the Paul Valéry talked about it as the intoxication with the new that somehow drives forward concepts of cultural modernization. I think it's a worldview in which constraint and limits and humility are very much prevalent. One can learn from examples around the globe. And of course, in the American Southwest, there are exceptional models of that. The hogan is used for both ceremonial purposes, for ritual, but also for living. For me, it's very rich because the mythical meaning of the building extends or transcends beyond its functional purpose.
The good side of a building is actually it sort of is a physical manifestation of a bigger goal. Now, when I say bigger goal, I actually mean that the building itself is a small part of the contribution we can make. So Sergio Palaroni says that 90% of the impact of his building goes beyond the physical building itself. So what does that mean? That means that in the design process, you're creating community, you're creating a sense of equity, people are involved in shaping their environment, you're empowering them. So these are things that, it's in the process, it's in this participatory process. And through that you can address things like systemic injustice or health inequality or discrimination. You can address these bigger issues that aren't really just about a building.
There's an increasing demand in the world, with all of its dysfunctional and inequitable systems, for design thinking, to think about possible futures that are different from the one that we have in front of us. And they're recognizing that design thinking and design methods are useful for things beyond the design of buildings. So increasingly, I think we're going to be asked to design strategies or systems. For example, we worked with a group of a community of people who were experiencing homelessness and the faith community to recognize that there's a federal law, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, that was on the books and underappreciated on the part of faith communities, that this actually enabled them to build extremely affordable housing on their land, even if it didn't meet zoning requirements. And so this was a way of using design as a strategy to leverage an existing law and reimagine its application to serve another kind of end. And so that is an example of how design can be a very effective strategic tool in helping us envision more equitable, just futures for ourselves.
There are many forms that arose in the 20th century of what we think of as engaged spirituality, where practitioners and curators of spiritual practices are working with communities to make sure that the spiritualities lead in the direction of social change, lead in the direction of the practice of justice and the expansion of participation and representation in the life of the community. So, for example, the movement called Engaged Buddhism, attributed to Thich Nhat Hanh in Vietnam. So it's a global movement to make spirituality effective in the social arena. Liberation theology is analogous. It takes Catholic spirituality and Catholic scripture and asks, what do the narratives of Jesus, what do the gospel stories have to say that would empower the community to make the change it needs regarding access to the goods of life from which it is presently being denied?
We don't have to start with a blank slate. Just take the idea of a nonprofit, for example. A nonprofit their mission is to serve the public. So a nonprofit architecture office is architecture that serves the public. Those are existing structures. And you can get funding from foundations, from donations once you're a nonprofit. There are other models where you can have hybrid, where you have a nonprofit and a for-profit architecture firm working together.
We really need to build power through, I think, unionization to start. By building solidarity and power within architecture, we are building a foundation to then be able to organize alongside others, other organized workforces, other grassroots movements. And through that expanded network of collective power that we're building, we can advocate for systemic change. So the Chicago Teachers Union is actually a great example of the sort of positive good that a union can do within a community. So they organize on the principles of bargaining for the common good. So as teachers, they understand that their work and their working conditions are completely entwined with the living conditions of their students. You know, you can start to imagine what a union of architects in Chicago could then do, right? So if you had a union of architects who joins in on this call for affordable housing and access to affordable housing, you know, between teachers and architects, we could pretty much shut the city down, right? And so, you know, in that way, we can have some real wins at the local and the national level. And so we're building both a better, more equitable form of practice, but we're also building solidarity with communities, with the communities that we're working within, and gaining their trust and their support, and making them part of this sort of vision for what the built environment could be.
Architects bring something to the table, the creative talent, the sort of artistic side, but that is never enough. We need to affirm the architecture with the outside, with the stakeholders, with others.
I think listening to alternative voices is more important now than ever before. I'm learning about the incredible resources of tribal colleges, where people are very much embedded in the local and the issues that are confronting their communities, and what it means to be a leader within their tribal community, with the struggles of grappling with being part of the 21st century with all of its trauma and messiness, and yet remaining true to traditional culture and values.
So I think that we're at this moment where we're reimagining the architectural profession and reimagining something as fundamental as what do we do in built space. And I think that those are issues that have to affect architectural education, that we can't simply judge a student's work by their end design product, and we need to be asking, how are you thinking? How did you arrive at that design? Who did you talk to? And who didn't you talk to? And whose voice wasn't heard? What kind of harm are you doing with your design? Not only what are the benefits of your design.
We need to change the expectations that students have of coming out of school, what their work could look like, and what is expected of them and what they can expect. It is completely designed to benefit employers at the expense of workers who are forced to make, dramatic sacrifices in terms of their health, in terms of their relationships outside of work. And this leads many people, especially women and people of color, to ultimately leave practice. And so we end up with a design workforce that is missing a lot of voices. And if we're talking about envisioning new forms of practice and what the future of practice looks like, these are voices that we really need to be part of that conversation.
I think there's a really exciting opportunity here for interdisciplinary collaboration between architects and other disciplines, and for architects to do their own homework about understanding who has been invisibilized in the history of architectural practice. So part of that work is for architects to do themselves about processes and practices of invisibilization, and then thinking about reparation for that history through ongoing and future architectural practice. Other colleagues from other fields can help in that process. Theologians, historians, anthropologists, by studying the history of architecture, by interviewing present architects, by observing architectural practices, can help architects get a handle on their own practice. And for that, you can't just ask yourself what's going on. You need critical perspectives from other fields to give you a 360-degree view about what actually the practice is accomplishing as it undertakes its work.